The person I interviewed was my grandma, who was born in December of 1946, which is just over a year after the end of World War II. The main time frame I focused on in the interview with her was the 60s and early 70s, where my grandma began her early adulthood. In this time frame, we specifically focused on the hippies and their anti-war protests, as well as their tactics they used to avoid getting drafted in the Vietnam War, as well as Pink Floyd's influence on these types of people. Other events came up, such as John F. Kennedy's assassination, as well as Martin Luther King's assassination. We spoke about how these events affected these people during this time frame. The first major point in the interview was the anti-war protests by the hippies advocating for the end of the Vietnam War. This is a page from a book called This Fabulous Century. My grandma had this book and it basically outlines some of the major points in each one of the centuries. Here you can see an anti-war protest where the protesters seem to be extremely passionate about ending the war in Vietnam. These people even went to extreme lengths and had a 250,000 person march against the war, as seen in this Sunday Star photo. In the interview, I spoke to my grandma about how she felt about the war, and to which she responded that she was against it. I asked exactly why this was, and she responded by saying news articles were constantly covering the war, and it covered the brutality of the war as well as the deaths. And she saw many people that were drafted at the age of 18, and specifically people she went to high school with that returned in coffins. The second main point that we talked about in the interview was avoiding the draft, and basically the tactics people use in order to avoid getting drafted into the Vietnam War. Here's another page from This Fabulous Century. This page is about the art of draft dodging, or avoiding the draft. According to this book, the two main ways that people avoided the draft was to either go to college or to immigrate to Canada. In the interview with my grandma, she mentioned to me that if her son was 18 in the time of war, that she would move him to Canada in order to avoid the draft. And thankfully this wasn't the case, as there was no major war after the Vietnam War that required the draft. My grandma also mentioned in the interview that there was another main way people avoided the draft that was quite common, and that was to be homosexual. Now, no matter if they were homosexual or not, they would pretend to be in order to avoid getting drafted. The third major point that was brought up in the interview was Pink Floyd's influence on the people of this time period. Pink Floyd was an extremely popular artist during this time period. As you can see in the cover art photo of an album my grandma owns, he looks like the typical hippie of the 60s and 70s. In the interview, my grandma spoke to me about how people followed his ways as an excessive drug user, and by listening to his famous song, Another Brick in the Wall, it promoted rebellion not only in the classroom, which is what the song is about, but against societal structure, such as the government and the Vietnam War. She truly believed that Pink Floyd had a massive impact on the rebellion against the government during this time period. The last thing we talked about during the interview was the assassinations of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, and how the assassinations of these leaders affected the people this time. Here you can see an article from the New York Times about the assassination of Martin Luther King that my grandma had held on to. Below the picture of Martin, it talks about the violent crimes that broke out from the black community, specifically in Brooklyn and Harlem, where 2 people were arrested in Brooklyn and 10 were arrested in Harlem for vandalism and arson. During the interview, I spoke to my grandma about how the white people were during this time period and how racist they actually were. She told me that the white people were extremely racist during this time period, and that none of their acts of racism were ever shunned by anybody, especially as they are today. A lot of people nowadays are a lot more aware of racism, and they seem to shun acts of racism, which is the way that it should be, as everybody's should be treated equal. Here you can see a news article from the New York Times on the John F. Kennedy assassination my grandma had also held on to. In the article, it speaks about how JFK was shot in the brain by a rifle bullet, and Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in on the presidential plane going back to Washington as the 36th President of the United States, just 99 minutes after the death of Kennedy. In the interview, I spoke to my grandma about how she felt about the assassination, to which she replied that she was sick and worried after, as many Americans were. She explained to me that John F. Kennedy was one of the most beloved presidents of American history, and that she recalls people actually breaking down in tears after the assassination.